The bull stood like a dark mountain against the whitewashed auction pen, his breath pluming in the crisp autumn air. His hide was the color of rich, turned earth after a rain, and the muscles in his shoulders and haunches shifted with a power that seemed to pull the very light of the day toward him. The auctioneer's voice was a frantic rattle, a cascade of numbers and praise, but Alara heard only the profound silence of the men lining the rails. Men whose fathers had told her a woman alone couldn't raise a fence post, let alone a prize bull. She felt the weight of their stares, a mixture of awe and disbelief that was, to her, a sweeter sound than any winning bid. She thought of the day he was born, slick and still in the straw, his back legs twisted into a grotesque question mark. She remembered the scent of milk and hay and the cold dread that had settled in the pit of her stomach. The day the vet had shaken his head, his face a mask of professional pity. "Put him down, Alara," he'd said, his voice gentle but firm. "He'll never walk." It's a kindness. 2 years earlier, the world had been mud and straw and the ragged, desperate sound of a mother cow's lowing. The birth had been hard, a long night of straining and waiting that left both Alara and the heifer, her best Jersey cross, exhausted and trembling in the lantern light. The calf had come into the world not with a healthy scramble, but with a heavy stillness. He was big, beautifully marked with a white star on his forehead, but his hind legs were tucked up under him at an angle that was deeply, unervingly wrong. Alara ran her hands over them, feeling the limp, unresponsive limbs. There was no tension, no fight, just a dead weight. She'd spent everything she had, the last of her husband's savings, on this small patch of land nobody wanted, tucked into a shallow basin the old-timers called Gable's Folly. They said the soil was too thin, the water too fickle. They said a woman alone was just planting a crop of failure. This calf, out of her best cow, was meant to be the start, the first small proof that they were wrong. Instead, he felt like a judgment. He was the living embodiment of their mockery, a broken thing born on a broken farm. It was a failure she could feel in her own bones. Doc Henderson arrived an hour after sunrise, his truck rattling down the rutted lane. He was a good man, but a practical one, his hands and his worldview shaped by the harsh arithmetic of ranching. He knelt in the straw, his examination swift and certain. He probed the calf's hips, straightened the legs as much as they would go, and sighed the heavy sigh of a man delivering a verdict he knew would hurt. "Tendon contracture," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "A bad one. Both legs. Might be genetic, might just be how he was folded up in there." He stood, his shadow falling over the small, still creature. "There's nothing to be done for it. He can't stand, so he can't nurse. Even if you bottle-fed him, which would be a fool's game, he'd never walk. He'll get sores. He'll waste away. The kindest thing you can do, Alara, is let me put him out of his misery." Alara looked down at the calf. He had lifted his head, his dark, wet eyes blinking slowly in the new light. He made a soft, questioning sound, a little grunt of life that went straight through her. She saw not a broken thing, but a flicker of a question, a life asking for a chance. Her nearest neighbor, Jed Gable, a man whose face seemed permanently weathered into a scowl of disapproval, had come over, drawn by the vet's truck. He leaned on the stall door, chewing on a piece of straw, his gaze pitiless. "Heard you had trouble," he grunted. "Henderson's right. Get what you can for the hide. No sense wasting good milk on bad stock. A woman's heart is too soft for this work. You gotta be hard." Alara felt a cold stillness settle over her. It was the same tone the banker had used, the same one the man at the feed store used. A condescending certainty that she, by her very nature, was not equipped for the reality of this life. She looked from Gable's smug face to Henderson's weary one, and then back to the calf. The arithmetic of it was clear. The milk he would drink was milk she couldn't sell. The time she would spend was time she couldn't put into the 100 other things the farm demanded. It was, by all logical measures, a losing proposition. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it filled the small space in the barn. Henderson raised his eyebrows. Gable snorted. "No." Henderson asked gently, "Alara, Be sensible, he's alive, she said, her voice finding a firmer footing. She ran a hand along the calf's spine. He's breathing. I'll not be the one to stop it. Gable pushed himself off the doorframe. Then you're a bigger fool than they say. Wasting time on that thing. You'll be broke by winter. He spat the straw onto the ground and stalked away, his disgust a palpable force. Henderson watched him go, then looked back at Alara. It's your farm, your decision, but don't let it break you. He packed his bag, the metallic click of the clasps echoing the finality of his judgment. Alara was left alone with the silent, broken calf and the overwhelming weight of what she had just chosen to do. She sat in the straw, the morning sun slanting through the dusty barn window, and began to do the math. The arithmetic of hope. The first week was a blur of exhaustion and doubt. Twice a day, Alara milked the mother cow, her hands aching, and patiently worked to get the colostrum into the calf. He had a strong suckle, a fierce will to live that seemed entirely at odds with his useless legs. He would pull at the bottle, his dark eyes fixed on her face, and for a few minutes she could almost forget the dead weight of his hindquarters. The real work began after each feeding. She had read in one of her father's old husbandry books about splinting lambs with broken legs. The principle had to be the same. She found 2 straight, sturdy pieces of scrap wood from a broken fence post and sanded them smooth, rounding the edges so they wouldn't cut into his soft hide. She tore strips from an old wool blanket for padding and used leather straps from a worn-out harness to bind them. The first time she tried to fit the splints, the calf struggled, bleeding in a thin, terrified cry. His legs were stiff, the tendons like hardened ropes beneath the skin. She had to be gentle but firm, working the limbs, stretching them a fraction of an inch at a time. Her hands, already calloused from farm work, grew rougher, the skin cracking at the knuckles. She learned the map of his muscles, the knots of resistance, the subtle tremors of pain. She began massaging his legs with warm tallow, her thumbs working in slow, deep circles to try and loosen the contracted tendons. The barn became her world. She rose before the sun and worked until long after it had set, the lantern hanging from a nail casting their 2 shadows, one large and stooped, one small and crumpled, against the old wood walls. The mockery from the town was a low, constant hum. When she went for supplies, men would stop talking and watch her pass. Women would offer pitying smiles. Heard her trying to save that crippled calf, the feed store owner said, weighing out her grain. Gable says you're just pouring money into a hole in the ground. Alara just nodded and paid for her supplies. Being right is its own kind of reply, she told herself, but in the quiet of the barn, doubt was a cold companion. By the end of the second week, she was bone-tired, and the calf's legs seemed no different. It was on one of those bleak afternoons that her other neighbor, Mrs. Vogel, appeared at the barn door. An elderly German widow who kept to herself. Mrs. Vogel had a garden that was the envy of the county and a reputation for quiet wisdom. She held a small jar in her hand. I see you work, she said, her voice soft, accented. She didn't look at Alara, but at the calf. Hard work. Alara felt a flush of shame, as if she'd been caught in her foolishness. The vet said I should put him down. Mrs. Vogel finally turned her eyes to Alara. They were pale blue and saw more than most. A vet sees what is. Now it can be, she held out the jar. Arnica and comfrey, from my garden, steeped in oil, for the massage. It will help the soreness. She stepped into the stall and knelt, her old bones creaking beside the calf. She laid a wrinkled hand on his back. What is his name? Alara shook her head. He doesn't have one. A thing must have a name to have a future, Mrs. Vogel said simply. She looked at Alara's splints, the careful patting, the determined set of her jaw. The root that grows in hard soil is the strongest, Liebling. Remember that. She left as quietly as she had come. That evening, as Alara rubbed the fragrant, dark green oil into the calf's legs, a small figure appeared at the far end of the pasture, watching from behind the fence. It was Tom, the Gable's youngest boy, a quiet, watchful child of about 10. He never said a word, just stood there, day after day, a silent witness to her struggle. The days bled into weeks. marked by the rising and setting of the sun and the slow, almost imperceptible changes in the calf. Alara fell into a rhythm that was part labor, part prayer. She would remove the splints, massage his legs with Mrs. Vogel's oil, and then work them through a series of stretches. She learned to read his body, to know the difference between the sharp twitch of pain and the dull ache of progress. She talked to him constantly, a low, steady murmur of encouragement. "That's it. Just a little more. You can do it." The calf, in turn, learned her scent, the sound of her footsteps. He would nuzzle his head against her arm, his breathing a warm, trusting puff against her skin. Tom was her constant, silent audience. He would appear at the fence line after his chores were done and watch, his chin resting on the top rail. He never offered advice or asked questions. He just watched. One afternoon in late spring, after nearly 2 months of the relentless routine, something shifted. Alara had the calf propped against her legs, trying to get him to put a sliver of weight on his feet. He had grown, his body thickening with muscle, but his back legs had remained limp appendages. She pushed him gently, urging him to lock his knees. He trembled, his whole body shaking with the effort. And then, for a single, breathtaking second, he stood. His back legs were splayed wide. His knees wobbled violently, but he was standing on his own 4 feet. A gasp escaped Alara's lips. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The calf held the pose for another second, his eyes wide with surprise, before collapsing back into the straw. But it had happened. He had stood. Alara looked up, her eyes bright with tears, and saw Tom. He was no longer at the fence, but standing just inside the open barn door, his own eyes as wide as saucers. He had seen it too. A slow smile spread across his face, the first she had ever seen on him. He took a hesitant step forward. "He's like an anchor," the boy said, his voice barely a whisper. Holding himself to the ground, Alara looked at the calf, who was already trying to push himself up again, his front legs scrabbling for purchase. Anchor. The name settled over him, a perfect fit for his stubborn, unyielding spirit. "Yes," Alara said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's his name." Anchor, it had worked. The impossible had happened. She kept the victory to herself, a secret joy she shared only with the quiet boy and the old German woman. When townsfolk asked about the crippled calf, she would just give a noncommittal shrug. "He's still with us." It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The town continued in its certainty of her failure, but Alara didn't care. She had her proof, banked low and warm like a coal under ash, waiting for the right time to catch fire. The arithmetic was changing. Hope was beginning to outweigh the cost. Summer arrived like the open door of a furnace, baking the thin soil of Gable's Folly. But in Alara's small basin, the grass stayed green longer. She worked with Anchor every day, and his progress was no longer measured in seconds, but in minutes. He learned to stand, then to take a clumsy, stumbling step, then another. His splints came off for good. His walk was ungainly at first, a rolling, sailor-like gait, but it was a walk. And as he walked, he grew. The rich milk from his mother and the good grass of the basin went into building a frame of astonishing size. By the time he was a yearling, he was already larger than any of the other calves his age in the county. His shoulders were broad, his chest deep, and his legs, though scarred and slightly crooked, were thick as oak posts. What was more remarkable was his temperament. Most young bulls were skittish and aggressive, full of nervous energy. Anchor was placid, possessed of a deep, abiding calm. He would follow Alara around the pasture like a giant, clumsy dog, resting his heavy head on her shoulder as she checked the fences. Tom was a daily visitor now, arriving with a pocket full of windfall apples that Anchor would gently lip from his hand. The boy's silence had given way to a quiet companionship, and he would help Alara with chores, his small frame wiry and strong. The town's mockery had faded, replaced by a grudging, bewildered curiosity. Wagons would slow as they passed her property, the drivers staring at the massive young bull grazing peacefully near the barn. They didn't know what to make of him. He was the calf everyone had condemned, now growing into something magnificent. The first real sign of her vindication came on a dusty afternoon in late August. A cattle drover, moving a small herd down the county road, stopped for water at her creek. He was a stranger, a man with a weathered face and eyes that knew cattle. He spotted Anchor in the pasture, and his jaw went slack. He walked over to the fence, his gaze sweeping over the bull's frame, from his thick neck to his powerful hindquarters. "Lord Almighty," he breathed. He looked at Alara, who was watching him from the porch. "Ma'am, where did you get a bull like that?" "He's got the bone structure of a prize breeder. I raised him," Alara said simply. The man whistled, long and low. "He's a bit rough in the walk, but the frame on him, I'm not seen the like. I'll give you $300 for him." Right now, $300 was more money than Alara had seen a year. It was enough to pay her taxes, buy feed for the winter, and fix the leaky barn roof. It was a fortune. The arithmetic screamed at her to take it. It was the safe, sensible thing to do. She looked at Anchor, who had ambled over to the fence and was nudging the man's hand with his wet nose. She thought of the nights spent in the barn, the smell of Mrs. Vogel's oil on her hands, the first trembling step. "Thank you for the offer," she said, her voice steady. "But he's not for sale." The drover stared at her as if she were mad, but then a slow respect dawned in his eyes. He nodded. "I don't blame you. A bull like that. He's a once-in-a-lifetime animal." The story of the drover's offer spread through the valley like wildfire. $300 for the cripple calf. The whispers changed. Jed Gable stopped his wagon by her fence one day, not to mock but to stare. He just shook his head and drove on, his face a mixture of confusion and something that looked almost like regret. The world was beginning to see what she had seen all along. The shifting tides of opinion brought new attention, not all of it welcome. A man named Silas Croft began to take an interest in Gable's folly and the miraculous bull it contained. Croft was a cattle agent from a city, a man who dressed in a fine suit and polished boots that seemed entirely out of place in the dusty county. He had a reputation for being sharp, for buying low and selling high, and for having a keen eye for an undervalued asset. He arrived one morning in a shiny black buggy, the likes of which had never been seen on Alara's Lane. He didn't wait to be invited, but came right up to the porch, removing his hat with a flourish. "Miss Alara," he said, his voice as smooth and oiled as his hair. "Silas Croft, I've been hearing tales about a rather remarkable bull you've raised." I had to see for myself. His eyes weren't on her, but on Anchor, who was grazing peacefully by the creek. Croft's smile was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze was cold and calculating, the look of a man pricing livestock or land or a person's resolve. "They weren't exaggerating," he said, a note of genuine surprise in his tone. "He's magnificent. Truly." He turned his smile on her. "It must have been a terrible struggle for you. A woman all alone, with a place like this to run. It's a heavy burden. And to raise an animal from such a difficult start. You should be commended." The condescension was a sweet poison, meant to flatter and disarm. Alara said nothing, her hands resting on the porch rail. She had met men like Silas Croft before. They saw a woman alone and saw not a person, but an opportunity, a weakness to be exploited. "I'm here to help you, of course," he continued, taking her silence for agreement. "An animal like that is too much for one person to handle. He needs proper management, a place where his potential can be fully realized. I'm prepared to offer you $400 for him. A very generous price. I think you'll agree. It would set you up for the winter very nicely." It was more money than the drover had offered, a staggering sum. But Alara saw the flicker of greed in his eyes. He knew the bull was worth far more. He was testing her, assuming her ignorance and her desperation. He was leaning on her perceived weakness. "That's not my price," she said, her voice quiet but unyielding. Croft's smile tightened. He had not expected to be refused. "My dear woman, perhaps you don't understand the market. This is more than fair. You won't get a better offer. He isn't for sale," she repeated. She looked past him, up at the sky. For weeks, it had been a relentless, bleached-out blue. No clouds gathered over the mountains to the west. The air was still and hot, and the creek, which usually ran strong well into autumn, had dwindled to a shallow ribbon of water. Mrs. Vogel had been watching the sky, too, her face etched with a familiar worry. "The land is thirsty," she told Alara just the day before. "When the crickets go quiet in the afternoon, a hard time is coming. The signs were there for anyone who knew how to read them." Silas Croft, with his city boots and his shiny buggy, saw only the prize bull. He didn't see the cracking earth beneath his feet. He left in a cloud of dust and frustration, but Alara knew he would be back. A man like that did not give up on something he wanted. The drought came on not like a storm, but like a thief. It stole the moisture from the ground, the green from the pastures, the hope from the faces of the ranchers. By September, the valley was a study in brown and gray. The great pastures of the larger ranches were bald, eaten down to the roots, and then baked to dust by the relentless sun. The creeks and ponds dried up, leaving behind cracked, clay pans that shimmered in the heat. The price of hay, shipped in by rail from greener lands, tripled, then quadrupled. A deep sense of desperation began to settle over the county. Cattle grew thin, their ribs showing like washboards beneath their hides. Men who had been proud and prosperous just months before now wore the haunted look of impending ruin. Jed Gable's herd was among the worst hit. His land was higher, more exposed, and his pastures were the first to burn out. He was forced to sell off half his cows for a pittance, just to afford feed for the other half. Every day, the train station was crowded with thin, miserable-looking animals being shipped off, the lowing of the hungry cattle a mournful soundtrack to the county's slow collapse. But in Alara's small, protected basin, things were different. The land was lower and the water table closer to the surface. Her careful management, never overgrazing, rotating anchor between two small pastures, had left the grass roots deep and strong. While her creek was low, it still flowed, a thread of life in a dying landscape. Anchor was thriving. His coat was sleek and glossy, his eyes bright. He was a portrait of abundance in a world of scarcity, a living testament to the wisdom of patience and care. Silas Croft saw it all. He became a constant, unwelcome presence in the valley, his black buggy a carrion bird circling the dying ranches. He bought up cattle for pennies on the dollar, acquired land from men too broke to pay their taxes. He was getting rich on their misery, his smile growing wider as their faces grew leaner. He saw Alara's green pasture and her magnificent bull not as a miracle, but as the final piece of his portfolio. He knew the county fair and sale was approaching. It would be a buyer's market for him, a place to consolidate his power. A prize bull like Anchor would allow him to control the breeding stock for the entire region for years to come. He would be able to set any price he liked, and the desperate ranchers, trying to rebuild, would have no choice but to pay it. The drought that was ruining everyone else was setting the stage for his greatest triumph. And Alara, a lone woman on a small farm, was the only thing standing in his way. Croft came again on a blistering afternoon when the air itself felt brittle. This time, he did not bother with false pleasantries. His face was hard, his voice stripped of its oily charm. He found Alara reinforcing a fence line, her face smudged with dirt and sweat. "I'm making you my final offer," he said, staying in his buggy, looking down on her. $500 for the bull. It's more than he's worth in this market, but I'm feeling generous. Alara didn't stop her work, twisting the wire tight with her pliers. "I told you. He's not for sale. Listen to me," Croft said, his voice rising with impatience. "Look around you. This drought isn't breaking. Gable is nearly wiped out. The Hendersons are selling their land. This whole valley is going under. You have one valuable asset. Sell him to me, and you can buy enough feed to last 2 winters. You'll survive. If you don't, you'll be finished by Christmas. One person alone cannot weather this." His words were meant to be a threat, a stark presentation of fact. But all Alara heard was the echo of Gable's voice from 2 years earlier. A woman's heart is too soft for this work. It was the same assumption of her weakness, her inability to endure. She finished twisting the wire and finally looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. "I'll take my chances," she said. Croft's face flushed with anger. "You are a stubborn fool. When you're starving, You'll remember this day. You'll remember the generous offer you threw back in my face." He snapped the reins, and his buggy sped away, leaving her in a cloud of impotent dust. The pressure was immense. Her own hay stores were dwindling. The arithmetic was turning grim again. The $500 he offered was a lifeline, but it felt like a betrayal. Selling Anchor to a man like Croft would be a betrayal of every hour of work, every moment of hope. One evening, there was a hesitant knock at her door. It was Jed Gable. He stood on her porch, his hat in his hands, his face haggard. He looked 10 years older than he had a few months ago. He couldn't meet her eyes. "Alara," he mumbled, his voice rough. My last few cows, they're going dry. I don't have enough feed to get them through the week." He finally looked up, and she saw not scorn, but a raw, desperate pride. He was a man broken by the land he thought he had mastered. He had come to the person he had mocked, the fool with the crippled calf, to ask for help. It was her chance to turn the knife, to remind him of his words. She could have savored the moment. Instead, she felt a pang of shared humanity. Hunger changes a town. It erases old grudges and redraws the lines of community. "I have a few bales I can spare," she said quietly. Gable flinched, expecting a price. "I can't pay you." "Not now, I'm not asking you to," she said. "Take them. Feed your cows." He stared at her, his mouth working, but no words came out. He simply nodded, a look of profound, humbled gratitude in his eyes. He followed her to the barn. As they loaded the hay into his wagon, he stopped and looked at Anchor, who was watching them from his pasture, his breath making soft clouds in the cooling air. "You were right," Gable said, his voice barely a whisper. "All of us, we were wrong. You saw something we didn't." It was the only apology he could manage, and it was more than enough. The day of the county sale dawned cold and clear. The grounds, usually a scene of boisterous celebration, were subdued. The pens held small groups of thin, listless animals, their owners standing beside them with the grim faces of men at a funeral. It was a fire sale, the final act of a devastating season. Silas Croft was the master of ceremonies, moving through the crowd with an air of confident ownership. He had already purchased the best of the breeding stock from a neighboring county, and he was ready to sell them to the local ranchers at prices that would put them in his debt for years. His victory seemed absolute. Then, a rumble of surprise went through the crowd. Alara was walking down the main path, leading Anchor. The bull moved with his slightly rolling gait, but he held his head high, his massive frame a startling vision of health and power against the backdrop of scarcity. He was calm amidst the noise and confusion, his trust in the woman holding his lead rope absolute. A hush fell over the auction pen as she led him in. He dwarfed every other animal there. He was not just a bull. He was a symbol of survival, of impossible hope made real. The auctioneer, a man who had seen thousands of animals pass through his ring, was momentarily speechless. He started the bidding low, a formality. "Who'll give me 100 for this magnificent specimen?" A dozen hands went up. The local ranchers, men who had pennies to their name, were bidding. The price jumped to 200, then 3. Silas Croft stood at the back, a smug smile on his face, letting them exhaust their meager resources. When the bidding slowed at 450, he raised a single, manicured finger. 500, he called out, his voice ringing with authority. A groan went through the ranchers. They were out. The auctioneer began his final call. 500 once, 500 twice. This was Alara's moment of triumph. The price was a fortune, a public vindication of her struggle. Croft was about to own her bull, but she would be rich, secure. The town would have to respect her. The arithmetic was finally, overwhelmingly, in her favor. But she looked out at the faces of her neighbors. She saw Jed Gable, his hands clenched, his face a mask of defeat. She saw the other men, their hopes of rebuilding their herds dying right in front of them. She saw a future where they were all beholden to a man like Croft. She saw a community not restored, but enslaved. And she knew what she had to do. "Wait," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the auctioneer's patter. Everyone turned to look at her. "Stop the sale." The auctioneer lowered his gavel, confused. Croft's smile vanished. replaced by a scowl of disbelief. Alara stepped into the center of the ring, placing a calming hand on Anchor's broad back. "He's not for sale," she said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke to the crowd of stunned faces. "Not to the highest bidder." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Silas Croft pushed his way to the front, his face dark with fury. "What is the meaning of this? We have a bid. A legal, binding bid. I'm withdrawing him from the sale," Alara said calmly, meeting Croft's glare without flinching. She then turned her attention back to the ranchers, to the men who had once mocked her. "This has been a hard year for all of us," she began, her voice carrying across the silent yard. "A bull like this, he's no good to just one person if the whole community is failing. We all need to rebuild. My neighbors need a chance." She took a deep breath. "So this is my offer. I'm not selling him, but I will offer his breeding service to any rancher in this valley. The price will be 1/10 of what Mr. Croft would have charged you. You can pay me in cash, or you can pay me in hay next summer, or a share of the calf once born. We will all get through this winter, and we will all rebuild." Together, for a long moment, there was only a stunned silence. The sheer, unexpected generosity of the act was something no one had been prepared for. They had come expecting to witness a transaction. They were instead witnessing an act of profound community. They looked from Alara's determined face to Croft's apoplectic one. They saw the choice she had made, not for profit, but for them. It was Jed Gable who broke the silence. He stepped forward, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He looked not at Alara, but at Croft. "We'll take her offer," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Another rancher stepped up beside him. "Aye, we'll take it." And then another, and another, a chorus of assent rising from the crowd, a wall of solidarity that pushed Silas Croft back. He stood there, exposed and outwitted, his greed laid bare for all to see. He had counted on their desperation, but he had not counted on her strength. He had miscalculated the arithmetic of the human heart. Without another word, he turned and stalked away, his polished boots kicking up dust, the sound of his angry retreat drowned out by the rising murmur of grateful voices. That afternoon, Alara's farm became the center of the valley's recovery. A line of men, Jed Gable at the front, came to her, not with money, but with plans, with promises, with a quiet, bone-deep respect that was worth more than any auction price. They spoke of the future, of calves that would be born in the spring, of herds that would grow strong again. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the recovering land, Alara stood by the pasture fence with Tom and Mrs. Vogel, who had come to watch the proceedings. Anchor was grazing peacefully, the fading light catching the rich, dark color of his coat. He was no longer just a bull. He was a promise. He was the strong root that had grown in the hardest of soils, now holding the entire community together. Mrs. Vogel placed a hand on Alara's arm. "You see, Liebling," she said softly, her pale blue eyes full of warmth. "A vet sees what is. A neighbor sees what can be." Alara watched the magnificent animal, the bull who was never supposed to walk, and felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She had been right. It was not a woman's soft heart that was unsuited for this life, but a hard one,